Hello. Welcome to the 2025 Hagel Lecture at the University of Chicago. A thank you to all of you who are here at the Rubenstein Forum this evening for tonight's event, and to all those joining the live stream broadcast, especially members of the U.S. military in Europe and around the world. I am Pape, Associate Professor of International Politics at the University of Chicago. The Chicago Project on Security and Threats, of which I'm an affiliate, is a nonpartisan research center at the University of Chicago dedicated to advancing scholarship on international politics, security, and economic relations that advances peace and prosperity. It does so by focusing on research questions that pertain to security broadly defined, about which scholars know as yet relatively little. Most importantly, the knowledge gained from studying the topic has the potential to impact policy decisions that enhance the security of the United States, nations, and peoples around the world. CPOST seeks to give voice to the heart of our country on important issues of American national security, and tonight's event is an important example. CPOST is proud to sponsor tonight's Hagel Lecture on Civil Politics and International Security. The Hagel Lecture Series was established in 2019 in collaboration with Secretary Chuck Hagel, CPOST, and the University of Chicago to promote open and informed debate on current foreign policy and national security challenges facing the United States and their implications for the country as a whole. At this moment, we cannot think of a better pair of individuals to participate in this year's lecture. Specifically, we are pleased to have in conversation with former Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel, former Director of Central Intelligence William Burns. Both have been highly invested in understanding American foreign policy and role in the United States and in the world. In a moment, my colleague, Professor Pape, will more fully introduce Director Burns. At this time, I would like to introduce Amanda Woodward, Dean of the Social Science Division at the University of Chicago and the William S. Gray Distinguished Service Professor of Psychology. Dean Woodward has been a leading supporter of CPOST and the Hagel Lecture, and it is with great pleasure that I introduce her now.
Thank you, everyone. Good afternoon and welcome. Welcome to everyone who's here with us in Friedman Hall, and welcome to everybody who's joining us by live stream. On behalf of the Division of the Social Sciences, I'm pleased to welcome you all and to welcome this event. I have to say this is one of my favorite events of the year, and I'm just delighted to have everybody here with us. Each year, the Hagel Lecture, named in honor of former Senator and Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel, provides important opportunity to discuss timely questions, challenges, and potential solutions from internationally renowned voices that encompass the social sciences. As many of you know, Secretary Hagel served as the 24th Secretary of Defense from February 2013 until February 2015. He is the only Vietnam veteran and the first enlisted combat veteran to serve as Secretary of Defense. During his tenure, he directed steps to modernize America's partnerships and alliances, advance the rebalance in the Asia-Pacific, bolster support for European allies, and enhance defense cooperation in the Middle East. He also led major initiatives to improve the lives of service members and their families. Prior to that, Secretary Hagel served 2 terms in the United States Senate from 1997 until 2009, representing the state of Nebraska. He's a graduate of the University of Nebraska at Omaha, and he served as a distinguished professor at Georgetown University. Now, many of you, like me, will recall the really vibrant and robust discussions that the Hagel Lecture has brought to us in prior years, starting with Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, former U.S. Ambassador to Russia Michael McFaul, and former DHS Secretary Jay Johnson. For this year's event, I'm really delighted to welcome Secretary Hagel and Director Burns. Thank you each for joining us on campus today to share your insights and your knowledge. And now I would like to introduce the moderator of this evening's event, Professor Robert Pape. A professor in the Department of Political Science and a faculty director of CPOST, Professor Pape works at the intersection of national policy and basic research, including the study of political violence, public endorsement of violence, and social prejudice. Most recently, Bob has worked extensively to understand the violent dangers to our democracy while continuing his ongoing work on international security strategy related to the Middle East and other regions. Now, many friends and donors to CPOST are among us this evening, and I want to join Bob in thanking you for your support. It's been so important to fuel the research that's been going on for more than a decade now. We're really grateful for your partnership in creating opportunities like this evening's event. And now I'll turn it over to my good colleague, Bob Pape.
Thank you, Amanda, for that kind introduction. Welcome, everyone. Tonight, we have an exciting program, and I think you're really going to enjoy it. As you just heard, CPOST asks the tough questions about America's national security. Our Hagel Lecture is a bright jewel in CPOST's crown, and we are delighted that Secretary Hagel has allowed us to form this series in his honor. Thank you very much, Chuck, for doing that. Thank you very much. We are also proud to have so many of the supporters of CPOST here, some of whom have come from quite far to be here tonight. And I won't go through and name all of them here. I'm sorry I can't do that. But I do want to thank some of the biggest longtime supporters that we have who really made an effort to be here. I would like to thank Bill Rubenstein, one of the co-chairs of our CPOST Advisory Board. Thank you very much. And I would like to thank Fouad Al-Nagar, who is another co-chair of our CPOST Advisory Board. And I just want to say that it's really a pleasure for someone who I first met Fouad when he was an undergrad at Dartmouth, and to see him flourishing. This is what all us professors really want to see, and to see this happen is just absolutely tremendous. There is no better person, though, to help us understand the tough issues today than former Director of Central Intelligence, William Burns. His list of awards and honors is just incredible. Born into a military family, Director Burns has combined extraordinary intellectual strengths with public service almost from the beginning. As a valedictorian of his high school class, a Marshall Scholar after graduating college, and entering the Foreign Service in 1982, swiftly rising through the ranks of what is an extraordinary 30-year career in the Foreign Service and State Department. Indeed, his career in public service culminated not once, but really 3 times so far. In the Bush administration as the ambassador to Russia from 2005 to 2008, and then culminated again in the Obama administration as Deputy Secretary of State from 2011 to 2014, and then culminated for a 3rd time as CIA Director in the Biden administration, and things may not be done yet. Almost anyone would be glad for just one of those high-level achievements, much less all 3 under both Republican and Democratic administrations. Rare bipartisanship in any era, possibly only rivaled by Chuck Hagel. But what makes Director Burns truly extraordinary are not his titles, but his impact. Director Burns has been at the center of more secret, high-level talks by the United States with foreign leaders than perhaps anyone over the past 20 years. It is more than fitting that he entitled the book he published in 2020 as a memoir, and maybe there's more coming, Back Channel. For example, he has directly engaged Vladimir Putin on Ukraine, held key secret talks with Iranian officials that led to the US and Iran nuclear deal in 2015, conducted back-channel discussions with senior Chinese leaders on Taiwan in the wake of the spy balloon crisis, and held crucial negotiations in the Middle East, including negotiations with Hamas, leading to the recent ceasefire and release of hostages just months ago. God only knows who else he's talked to, because we need to remember, as the director of the CIA, most of what he does is actually secret. For his extraordinary contributions to American foreign policy and security, Director Burns has received 3 Presidential Distinguished Service Awards and the highest civilian honors from the Pentagon and the United States intelligence community. Now, please, join me in welcoming Director Burns to the University of Chicago as our 5th annual Hagel Lecturer. Just stand up. Just 1 second. So as you could expect, we're going to discuss some tough questions about America's security. And I want to start with Ukraine. And this is fitting for several reasons. Not only is Ukraine obviously very important, and Vladimir Putin, you're going to hear a big story in just a moment, but in 2005, I think it was, this is when then U.S. Ambassador to Russia, Burns, met with Chuck Hagel. He had met him before, of course, but in Moscow. And this wasn't just Chuck Hagel, but I think it would be good for you to know that there's actually not just policy, but there are personal relationships that get built. And this is one of the big things that I hope at some point in the answer to this question you'll be able to refer to, because aside from all the details of inside, we really would like to talk about the days when we used to get along. But here's where I'd like to start with Ukraine. So in your book, Director Burns, you describe a stunning private conversation you had with Russian President Vladimir Putin in March 2008. Just as Ukraine's membership in NATO was becoming a serious issue. As you recount, Putin said, and I quote this from your book, and this is Vladimir Putin's words, "No Russian leader could stand idly by in the face of NATO membership for Ukraine. We would do all in our power to prevent it." Now, 15 years later, Putin invaded Ukraine, and the Russia-Ukraine war has been the most devastating in Europe since World War II, with 700,000 Russian military casualties, according to our Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin in January, and 400,000 Ukrainian military casualties, according to President Zelensky in December. So here are my questions that I'd like to ask both of you to help us understand. Was Russia's invasion of Ukraine always inevitable, or could we have done more to deter it? And what is at stake for America's security in this conflict?
Well, first, it's great to be here with all of you. Great to be at the University of Chicago, an institution for which I have great respect. And I really am delighted to share the stage with a public servant for whom I have great respect and admiration, Chuck Hagel. The quote from Vladimir Putin brings back lots of memories. He'll never be confused with Mr. Congeniality. Well, first on Putin, then on Ukraine, in answer to your questions. I mean, over the years, as I wrote in that book, I found Vladimir Putin to be a combustible combination of grievance and ambition and insecurity. He is relentlessly suspicious, not a big believer in the better angels of human nature. He's a big believer in control and intimidation and getting even. And, over the course of the quarter century since I've known him, because I served twice in Moscow as a diplomat, from 2005 to 2008 as ambassador, I watched as, as his grip on power tightened, as his circle of advisors narrowed into a pretty small group of people who either shared his very hard views of the world and of Russia, or at least had learned a long time ago it wasn't career enhancing to question his views. And in the meantime, I also watched as his risk appetite and his sense of destiny deepened as well. And nowhere was that sense of destiny clearer or more brutal than with regard to Ukraine. Putin, I've always found, has a singular fixation on controlling Ukraine and its choices. Putin does not believe that Russia can be a great power in his eyes, or that he can be a great Russian leader without controlling Ukraine. And as I moved into my last job as director of CIA, by the fall of 2021, we could see very clearly, and we had collected some truly remarkable intelligence across the US intelligence community about his plans to invade Ukraine. And tactically, I think he saw the winter of 2021, 2022 as an opportunity. He was convinced that Ukraine is a weak and divided country. He used to say, I've heard him say this many times, that Ukraine is not a real country. He saw it as a kind of historical and cultural appendage of Russia. I remember one time him making that argument to then Secretary of State Condi Rice when I was ambassador in front of a roaring fireplace in a dacha outside Moscow. Putin's disposition was not much improved by the fact that Condi was wearing heels and so towered over him in front of the fireplace. But he was absolutely convinced of that. And tactically, as I said, he thought Ukraine would be an easy mark at that point. He didn't have a great deal of respect for President Zelensky, which turned out to be a vast underestimation of that very courageous leader. He thought the Europeans were distracted by political transitions and elections in France and in Germany. He thought the United States, in the wake of COVID, was focused internally and, after a very difficult withdrawal from Afghanistan. He thought he had modernized the Russian military to the point where it was capable of quickly subduing the Ukrainian military. He thought he had sanctions-proofed the Russian economy. And it turned out that a lot of those assumptions were very badly flawed. But he also saw that moment towards the end of 2021 as a moment when strategically his window was closing to control Ukraine, in part because of what he had done in 2014 in annexing Crimea. He could see the movement of Ukraine towards the West, toward Western institutions, and he wanted to arrest that. And he decided to use force to do that. The issue of NATO membership, as I pointed out when I was ambassador in Moscow, was certainly a neuralgic one, not just for NATO membership for Ukraine, a neuralgic one for Putin and for many in the Russian political elite. But by the beginning of 2022, when he launched his invasion, it wasn't the only reason, in my view at least, that he launched that invasion. It was one of a number of reasons, but the bigger concern was that he believed it was an entitlement for Russia to control Ukraine, and that Ukraine belonged in Russia's sphere of influence, which we may dismiss as a very 19th century view of global politics, but it's very real in Putin's mind at least. And so he saw that as a moment when he both needed to act and could act. And when I wrote from Moscow as ambassador, that NATO membership for Ukraine was a red line in the eyes of Putin and many in the Russian political elite, I was doing my job, which was to make sure policymakers in Washington understood the depth of conviction on Putin's part. It wasn't an advocacy as to whether Ukraine should be in NATO or not be in NATO. But I think by the time he launched his invasion, this was about more even than the issue of NATO membership. It was about the reality that he thought if he did not control Ukraine, that this would ultimately be a threat to Russia. And for him, the idea of a sovereign, prosperous, healthy democracy in Ukraine on Russia's border was a threat. because it would undermine, as he saw it, the deeply repressive political system that he had created. And so there were a lot of factors that led to that invasion. But ever since I've known and observed Putin, that singular fixation with controlling Ukraine and its choices, left a very powerful impression on me.
That's some depth. Thank you very much. Chuck, just to build on what Director Burns is talking about, could you help us understand, and you've been involved with dealing with Putin, Crimea, 2014, so of course, you Secretary of Defense right at that point in time, but can you help us understand what's really at stake here in this conflict for America?
Well, everything that Bill has said, I agree with. But before I answer the question, I want to thank Bill for coming in and doing this. There's no one that I've worked with over the years that I have more regard for, respect for, and admiration for than Bill Burns. The jobs that he's had on behalf of this country, you just named 3 of them, but there are so many other jobs that he had, big jobs, on behalf of the country, and he's done them all spectacularly well. I go back to what Putin has said more than once. The worst thing, most disastrous thing that's happened in the world in the last 100 years was the implosion of the Soviet Union. And Bill talked about that in some detail. He has always been set, as Bill said, on resurrecting that as much as he can. He's not going to resurrect all the 16 Soviet republics. But you start with Ukraine because if you look at the history of Russia, I mean, Russia actually started in Kyiv centuries ago and then moved out. And it is, I think by most Russian standards, it is part of Russia, and that's the way they see it. And he being a KGB officer, where he got his start, and I think very much defined by that, has always in particularly seen Ukraine as the most important piece to get back for Russia. Bill also made the statement, I think it's correct, but important in understanding that it's more than just Ukraine. And he sees, I think, a weakening of the West. And this is, I'd say this even before Trump got elected for the second time. I mean, when you look at Trump's first term and what Trump said about NATO and it's weak and they've lived off the United States, this guy Putin is a very clever guy. And he sees all of those dynamics and dimensions as cracks in the Western power structure. Ukraine, since 1992, when it first became an independent country, has had internal problems. And Bill referenced some of those. And corruption has not been one of the most, or the less important ones. But in Zelensky, the Ukrainians elected someone who was totally different than anybody they've ever had leading that country for obvious reasons. And he miscalculated in many ways. But here's where I think it's most important to give some analysis to that miscalculation. I always have believed that an independent nation, a free nation, which Ukraine became in 1992, should always have the ability to make their own decisions for their own reasons. And I apply that to the issue of NATO. Could maybe we have done some things over the years to deal with that reality? Maybe not. But you can't compromise away freedom. If you believe in freedom, and your democracy was founded on freedom, and we have a constitution, and we're a nation of laws, a free country is a free country, and that means everything that goes with that. and the citizens' decisions to make their own decisions and their right to make those decisions, whether it's NATO or European Union, joining those institutions or not. So I know there are arguments on both sides of that, but I'll end this way. What Bill said, and I think his points about there are a lot more issues involved here than just the one simple one is exactly right. And what he's done too, Putin, is he has become a Stalinist figure in Russia. I mean, he controls everything in Russia, everything. And that's not what we had hoped the United States and the world had hoped after the implosion of the Soviet Union. And we had hoped that Russia would turn to a future that would give its people more opportunities, more freedom. And it didn't. And unfortunately, how that gets turned around, when it gets turned around, if it gets turned around, I don't know. But in the meantime, there's a lot of danger yet to play out with dealing with Russia for the future.
Can I just add three really quick things? I promise they'll be quick. I mean, the first is on the what's at stake question, because I think from Putin's point of view right now, while it is smart to engage in negotiations to see if this conflict can't be brought to a just conclusion, beginning with a ceasefire, Putin's not in any rush on negotiations right now, because he is as determined as he was in February of 2022 to subordinate, to subjugate Ukraine to Russian national purposes. And even beyond that, his strategic aim here is to try to create a fissure between the United States and our European allies. And some of that is already, from his point of view, in train now anyway, given the fractious nature of the new administration's relationships with our allies already. So, he's focused like a laser on those two objectives. And as I said, I don't think he's going to be in a hurry to reach the end of a negotiation, because he still believes, for all the mistakes he made, especially in the first year of the war, that time's on his side, that he can grind down the Ukrainians and wear down the rest of us. He's always thought, in my experience, that Americans have attention deficit disorder and will move on to some other issue. So I just wouldn't underestimate that conviction. And more broadly, what's at stake here is a pretty important principle of international relations. People can disparage, the liberal international order, or whatever term you want to use, but one of the core principles, one of the core rules, is that big countries don't get to swallow up parts of smaller countries just because they think they can. So if you're Xi Jinping looking at Taiwan, some years down the road, or the South China Sea, the consequences of what's happening in Ukraine, as important as Ukraine itself is, as it should be, go far beyond Ukraine, far beyond even European security. This is one of those rare plastic moments, I think, on the international landscape that come along, maybe a couple of times a century. The last one, I experienced the end of the Cold War, but it was really the end of, World War II and the creation of the post-war order. And if we're playing without a net, without any set of rules, you're creating opportunities for people like Putin now. Second thing I'd say very briefly is that I am intensely proud of the role that the agency I was proud to lead for 4 years has played in Ukraine. We were the only agency that stayed on the ground in Ukraine from before the invasion, through the invasion, to afterwards. The intelligence we collected and have shared with the Ukrainians has been enormously important to their ability to defend themselves. It was enormously important to President Biden's ability to put together a strong international coalition. And, the president's decision to do something a little novel, to declassify some of our secrets in a very careful way so we didn't betray sources and methods of intelligence, to deny Putin the ability to create false narratives, which I had watched him do over the years, because he had all sorts of what are called false flag operations that he wanted to create at the end of 2021, beginning of 2022 in eastern Ukraine, to be able to try to blame the Ukrainians for provoking a conflict. And so I think the very careful and disciplined declassification of some of those secrets turned out to be a very important tool of statecraft as well. And so as I have huge respect for the courage and tenacity of Ukrainians, but I have that same admiration and respect for what CIA officers have contributed over the course of the 3 years of this war. The last thing I'd say is your story about August 2005, when then Senator Hagel came to Moscow. My family and I had been in Moscow for less than a week, I think, by that point. And at the same time, Senator Dick Lugar and then Senator Barack Obama were separately visiting Moscow as well. So I remember the dinner we had at Spaso House, which is the grand, residence of the U.S. ambassador in Moscow. And I remember how considerate you, as well as Barack Obama and Dick Lugar, were to our two daughters who were just getting ready to start a new school. Then the next morning, I remember Chuck set off to Siberia, I think Lake Baikal. And Obama and Lugar made an interim stop at a place that was where the United States was supporting the destruction of Soviet nuclear warheads, or now Russian nuclear warheads, en route to Ukraine. They ended up getting detained with their US military aircraft in this Russian city on their way to Ukraine. Basically, the local officials were trying to extort an exorbitant landing fee. But I had visions of the shortest tenure for any American ambassador in Russia. And I remember having to wake up the first deputy foreign minister from his slumber in a dacha on a Sunday afternoon, who finally sprung the two senators in their plane. Fortunately, they were two very even-keeled senators, and so my job was intact. But anyway, that's what I remember.
Well, I headed for Siberia, so I was
Good choice.
Yeah, nobody. What the hell to go to Siberia? Why'd you do? I went to Siberia because of I wanted to see Lake Baikal in that area because of exploration, oil exploration, and so on. But very interesting trip. But Bill and Mrs. Burns were very gracious that night to us, because all of a sudden I'm there, and he told me to come, and I no, I'm not going to come and disrupt your family. No, come up for dinner. Then the doorbell rings a half hour later. Then it's Obama and Lugar. So we had one hell of a party that night.
I still remember this image of Barack Obama, who was then a very junior senator, not very well known, walking a red square with his Chicago White Sox cap on, and nobody thinking much of that too. So that changed a few years later.
Lugar came for the vodka. I think that was what it was. I think.
As you can see, there used to be quite a bit of bipartisanship. So we could go on, but folks, in about 15 minutes, we're going to turn it over to questions from the audience, so you can follow up on this. But I want to shift over to the Middle East, and especially Iran, an area that both of you, for decades, have been deeply, deeply involved in. But I just want to focus in on the issue of Iran and a nuclear weapon, because this can fundamentally change the architecture in the Middle East, as you both know so well. And you also both were in the Obama administration at a truly crucial point and truly crucial positions. So Director Burns, before becoming CIA director under President Biden, you were at the heart of the secret negotiations with Iran that led to the nuclear deal in 2015. So not just a kind of another person. And that led to the successful removal of 97% of Iran's enriched uranium. Secretary Hagel, you were defense secretary during these years when all kinds of issues with Iran and whether or not this was going to go south would directly impact you, not to mention American interests. But what I'd like to really ask both of you to reflect on with this particular issue is, what are your thoughts about the benefits and risks of the 2015 nuclear deal? And could you help us understand why the U.S. was able to make a deal with Iran in 2015, but not again during the Biden years?
Sure, I'm glad to start. And yeah, I did help lead the secret talks with the Iranians over the nuclear issue through most of 2013, which helped produce the comprehensive nuclear agreement that was reached about a year and a half later. That agreement, both the interim agreement we reached at the end of 2013 and then the comprehensive one, neither of those were perfect. In my experience in the Middle East over the last 40 years, perfect is rarely on the menu. But what it did do, in my view anyway, was significantly constrain Iran's ability to break out from a very limited civilian nuclear program to a weapons program. It imposed a series of quite intrusive verification monitoring measures that would enable us and others in the international community to see if the Iranians were trying to cheat and to weaponize as well. I think, and I said this at the time, I was out of government by this point, that it was a mistake for the first Trump administration to pull out of that agreement at a time when, for all the other threats that this Iranian regime creates. And it's not just about the potential for a nuclear weapon, it's also about the support for a variety of terrorist groups across the Middle East, the active plotting to assassinate American former leaders as well as, current leaders as well. So, this Iranian regime poses huge threats and huge dangers to the United States. However, I think on the nuclear program, it's a good thing that the current administration seems to be re-engaging in negotiations. They will be very tough. In my own experience, which is where most of my white hair came from, negotiating with Iranians, it is not an easy task. There's some very fundamental questions that have to be addressed at some point in the negotiations, like, does the Iranian regime come out of this, as they did in the comprehensive nuclear agreement, with a very limited domestic enrichment program to enrich uranium for civilian purposes, or do you try to eliminate that entirely? Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel has talked about the Libya model, where, more than 20 years ago, I was involved in those negotiations too. We persuaded, with a great deal of pressure, Muammar Gaddafi to get out of the business of terrorism and to give up what was a rudimentary nuclear program, basically lock, stock, and barrel. I don't personally think that this Iranian regime is going to agree to zero domestic enrichment. And again, in the comprehensive agreement, that was limited to under 5%, which is what you need for a civilian program, not for a weapons program. But that's going to be one of the big challenges. But I think to hold out for the Libya model is virtually to ensure that you're not going to be able to negotiate an agreement. There's lots of other things that you can do to tighten the screws on this Iranian regime. I can't imagine that you wouldn't want to talk about some of those regional issues, that you wouldn't want to insist that this Iranian regime can't continue to plot against American political figures and leaders. So this may be a more expansive effort at negotiations, but I think it's a good thing at least to pursue it right now because the risks of military conflict in the Middle East are always quite considerable as well. And this is a moment when, this is the last thing I'd say, the Iranian regime is weakened in a lot of ways. As much bravado as you hear from Tehran, their economy is in considerable difficulty. The so-called axis of resistance from Bashar al-Assad's regime in Damascus to Hezbollah to Hamas has been badly weakened over the course of the last couple of years. In the case of Assad, he's no longer with us in Syria, which is a very good thing for the people of Syria who suffered under his rule. So there is an opportunity here, I think, but it's going to require some, very hard-nosed diplomacy, patience, and persistence.
So Chuck.
Well, I would add to what Bill said. First, generally speaking, that was a significant accomplishment. The deal that he put together, that Bill and others and signed off on 2015. And one of the reasons it was so significant over many, but for the first time, it would allow American inspectors into Iranian facilities in Iran. The second thing that I always thought was one of the most important parts of this agreement that got very little play was it opened up Iran. It opened up Iran economically. So you had Europeans flying in and out of there on trade and different possibilities. What could we bring Iran? Why was that important? For the young people, the next generation, to see that, who are not enthusiastic supporters of the Ayatollah. But they've got no options now. They've got no choice now. But this gave them options to open, to see this opening. Now, it wasn't going to change things in a year, but it was going to change things. So many things like that that got facilitated that were consequences of the deal that was made, especially consequences of the bigger pieces of this. Now, as Bill knows because he negotiated it, two aspects of that deal did not get addressed, but he didn't have any choice. One was missiles, the other was terrorism. And the Iranians, and Bill agreed, and we agreed, all right, let's get this piece done, the biggest piece, most important piece, the atomic weapon, the subterfuge issue, and so on, to enhance their nuclear capabilities. In fact, cut their nuclear capabilities to zero. That was the big one. We could then develop the trust and confidence we needed to get to the next two steps. That never really was defined or explained very well in the United States, I didn't ever think. But they were so important to get to the next step. I think President Trump made a huge mistake in what he did in his first term. And now, as Bill said, it's going to be a lot more difficult, even though Iran is in a weaker spot. But in some ways, they're forced dangerously into a corner. And I think we've got to be very careful with that, how that comes out. So those would be just some additional points I would make to what Bill's already said.
And I think they actually lead to a bigger question I'd like to ask both of you to reflect on. Each of you have been in these high-level positions for a long time, and of course also in the Senate before. And you have also looked back, and I'd like you to look back and reflect on what are the major lessons that you've learned about how American power, whether it's in the form of military power or our intelligence advantages and diplomatic advantages, are best used to advance America's national security?
Well, I would say fundamentally you start with the most basic elements of any relationships in life. Whether it's human to human, it doesn't make any difference. And that's trust and confidence. And you have got to build trust and confidence within the realm of alliances, of partnerships. You need partners. This nonsense about America first and we don't need anybody else. The reason America has been able to project power since World War II all over the world is because of our alliances, quite frankly. If we didn't have the relationships that we've got around the world to base our assets, put our troops, put our ships, put our planes, CIA, all the other assets we have, we couldn't have projected the power that we do, as powerful as we are. So alliances and the strength of those alliances give us options. And I go back to a point that Bill made in how he had addressed partly your question about what Putin wants to do. Putin wants to dismantle and see that the post-World War II world order is dismantled. Because if you accomplish that, then you break that alliance that America has dominated and has been so good for us. Yes, it's been good for other countries too, but it's been good for the world. There's been no World War III, no nuclear exchange. More people are free than ever in the history of man. More people prosperous, more people educated. We've got problems. We're going to have more problems. Yes, but it's how we manage those problems through collective security, NATO, through the United Nations, through all the agencies that came about as a result of the world that we reinvented with our allies after World War II for all people, not just America. And so I think we don't want to underestimate how critical that's been. And in answer to your question, what's important here as you move forward here, you've got to have those basic tenets of trust and confidence, rule of law. Freedom of navigation, for example. And the other thing I'd say, and then Bill's got some more intelligent comments, I'm sure, but you've got to understand that the world is made up of different interests, but all those interests are interconnected. Tariffs, our economy, trade, they aren't just about economic issues. They're about political structures. They're about security, defense, global strategy, relationships. And everything is interconnected. That's the world that we live in. We're not going backward. It's going to get even more interconnected. And I don't care what a president says, America first because we're alone and so on, and we'll make America great again and the rest of the world's on their own. You don't want that world. You don't want that world where America is not the leader of the world and doesn't have the confidence and trust of most nations, because it's like nature. Nature abhors a vacuum, and there will be a vacuum, and somebody will fill that vacuum. Do you want China to fill it? And I think we better think through those things.
I just add two things. I mean, the first, as Chuck said, is that you have to understand the international landscape that exists at this moment. The United States is no longer the only big kid on the geopolitical block in the way that at the end of the Cold War we were. I still believe we have a better hand to play than any other country, any other power. But we have to understand that. We also have to understand that what sets us apart from lonelier rivals like China and Russia, at least today, is the fact that we have a network of allies and partners. We have the ability to work with them as well as with our rivals to try to set rules. Whether it's about how do we deal with the existential challenge of climate change, how we deal with pandemics, how we deal with the revolution in technology, and the ways in which artificial intelligence are going to transform everything from the intelligence profession, all the way through the way people live, work, fight, and compete. So it's important to understand, just as Chuck said, that at this moment on the international landscape, those alliances and partnerships are more important than ever to the United States. The second and final point is that, to get to your question about the different tools of U.S. national security, whether it's defense and the U.S. military or diplomacy or intelligence or development, it really is important for us to focus on how we bring those different tools into balance so that we're not overemphasizing military tools in some instances and underemphasizing diplomacy, so that we're continuing to invest in all of those tools, which is why I think it's crazy to dismantle the Agency for International Development. You have to continue to invest in all of those tools, because it's by putting them together in a thoughtful and sensible way in which we guard against the dangers of overreach, we guard against the dangers of overemphasis on one of those tools at the expense of the others. That's the way in which, on this very combustible and competitive international landscape, we're able to promote American interests, American values. It's by making common cause with allies and partners.
So I'm sure the audience is bursting with questions, and this is going to be the last question I'm going to ask. And while they're answering, we're going to have our CPOST students. There are 2 microphones here. And so if you want to ask a question, start to signal to the students, because we're going to try to get as many in. And what I'd like to do is just go from one microphone to the other. So please start to do that. But The final question I'd like to ask each of you is, in some ways, maybe the toughest question of all, which is, what kept you up the most at night?
Oh, well, I mean, I found especially in my last job, 4 years as director of the CIA, that a certain amount of interrupted sleep comes with the territory. I'd say two things. I mean, first, honestly, I can point to terrorism or any number of, individual issues that matter enormously. But honestly, what kept me up at night was concerned about the officers that I was doing my best to lead, because as director of the CIA, leading a group of really admirable Americans who are doing very hard jobs in very hard places around the world, I could help anticipate risk, I could help mitigate it, I could not make it go away, because there's no such thing as a zero risk environment in that profession. So that kept me up at night. The last thing I'd say, what literally kept me up at night is about a year ago, I guess, I agreed on what I thought was a good idea at the time to take part in the last overnight exercise of what's called the Special Operations Training Course, which is the first course that new CIA operations officers take. Thought it was a good idea. This ran from like 8 p.m. till 6 a.m. About 3 a.m. in the deep, dark woods of Virginia, I wasn't so convinced. But it turned out to be a really remarkable experience, because I watched the newest officers at CIA learning not just the tools of the trade, but also to look out for one another, the importance of teamwork, which is crucial in any of the national security professions that we've been talking about here. And as I watched over the course of that long night, I could see them developing that commitment to teamwork and that sense of it. Many of the officers had extensive military backgrounds. There was one, really fine officer, a woman in her early 40s, a mother of 4, who had no military experience, but she contributed just as much to that exercise as anybody else. The exercise culminated about 5 o'clock in the morning in a simulated hostage rescue mission led by, Delta team from Fort Bragg or Fort Liberty in North Carolina, who came up, and they had been told there were a group of CIA officers led by someone impersonating a senior CIA officer who had been taken captive by a hostile force. So it was worth the price of admission to see the very impressive young Army major coming up the stairs and seeing a real live CIA director tied to a chair. So that literally kept me up at night.
Well, I didn't expect that. Chuck, what was keeping you up at night? And do you sleep better now?
The fact that Burns is not CIA director that any longer, I can't sleep. I mean, I'm drinking more nowadays. Well, this may be a little out of the area we've been discussing, but not really. What keeps me up more than anything else, and it did even when I was Secretary of Defense, and when I left the Senate, I was co-chairman of the President's Intelligence Advisory Board. So I saw all the intelligence for 4 years, and and it gets to what Bill's talking about, is the quality of our people consistently that we've had in our government doing these jobs that we take for granted. And I mean, we're not all cut out to be CIA director or a major in the Delta Force, and not at all. But the quality of our people in our democracy has been so key to the success and the freedom of our country. And I think we tend to not recognize that very often. And especially now with the political environment we have in this country, to castigate government people as lazy and stupid, and they don't deserve any consideration. Boy, that's dangerous, and because that plays into an authoritarian hand that you don't want. And these people who do all these different jobs, CIA, Pentagon, all the jobs that we have in our government to make our lives better and make our system freer and sustain that freedom, they're critical to the future of our democracy. So, I mean, I'm an optimist, and I always have been, but I'm a realist too. And I think for the first time we're being forced to make, and this may not be a bad idea or reality of what we're dealing with. We're being forced to take a look at ourselves in very critical ways, which I think will come out of this okay. But it's a bit unnerving, I think, for a while.
That's great. So we're going to go to questions. Let's see, start here. Art is in the middle. Keep your hand up so I know that student. And then we'll get somebody over here in a second. Whoop.
No? Okay, there you go. Thank you.
Good.
Thank you both for your time. So this question goes to both of you. One thing that I'm interested in right now is how the U.S. withdrawal from Europe specifically will change the dynamic between China and Europe. And you, sir, mentioned how nature abhors a vacuum. And based on your experience, I'm interested in whether you think that China has a viable strategy to pick up the pieces that the U.S. drops in Europe, whether the Belt and Road Initiative would be a viable tactic, and if not, what challenges or opportunities you perceive China and Europe to face in the near future.
Well, I'll go ahead and start.
Sure.
Well, I think China is applauding everything that's going on. And I think China is probably asking itself, my God, what good fortune. In my mind, there are no questions that there will be severe consequences if we see the Western alliance unravel, or NATO specifically. But NATO is just a part of that Western influence, because it's the one democratic influence that the world has looked to since World War II. I mean, you've got other countries in the world, in other regions and continents, that some are democratic, but not like Europe and the United States and Canada. And you start to unravel that, there will be severe consequences in the world. And it will play to the benefit of authoritarian leaders and governments like Communist China and Russia.
No, all I would add is I think in many ways the Chinese leadership now sees a target-rich environment in the sense that, you know, the strain in U.S.-European ties creates an opportunity at the very moment where in recent years, I think we saw a number of our European allies becoming more concerned about everything from predatory Chinese trading practices to, you know, the way in which China has supported in quite significant ways Russia's aggression in Ukraine. So just at that moment, you know, the strains in that alliance create some opportunities for Xi Jinping and the Chinese leadership.
Okay, so let's see, Rick, why don't you, we'll come, Rick. Then we'll come up.
Director and Secretary Chuck, I actually just joined your advisory council. I want to flip Bob's question about what keeps you awake at night. You've both made it a compelling, articulate case for how we need relationships, we need experience, we need statecraft, none of which I'm seeing. That we have an isolationist policy that makes no sense. We're ignoring soft power and USAID. We're blowing up alliances. What gives you hope, if I may ask? And if you can't tell me for the United States, what gives you hope as sort of an end game that would get us there at the moment? Because I'm pretty pessimistic.
Yeah. Well, I'll start and you can finish. What gives me hope is yes, we have a constitution. Yes, we are a nation of laws. Yes, we have 3 co-equal branches of government. The architecture, the structure, all of that. But something more important than that, to me, the people of this country. I've always believed that Americans are good people. They're fair people. Yeah, I mean, you can have differences of opinion, left, right. We've always had that, though. But and not every American, 330 million of us, is an upright citizen. I get that. So I'm not Pollyannish about this either. But I do believe in our people. And I think our people are trying to sort out some things right now. And, you know, we're sometimes a bit naive. That's gotten us in trouble. And that's, yes, partly the result of bad leadership, of leadership not telling the truth to the American people, and other aspects of that. But we eventually get it right. But that all said, here's the caveat. We're living now at a time when we don't have the time to go back and self-correct. And we've always had that time in this country. We got 27 amendments to the Constitution. 2 of those amendments, we had to go back and get it right. We finally decided Americans like to drink. So we got that one right. But we don't have the time now because the world is all about immediacy. It's now, now, now. And that's the real caveat to all the strengths I think we have that gives me hope, that we're going to have enough time, especially in a world of immediacy, to self-correct. Because once you lose, for example, what we've been talking about, confidence and trust of our allies, boy, pretty hard to get that back. Pretty hard to get that back, if you can ever get it back. And our allies and our friends and partners, they always have alternatives, whether it's trade with China or whatever. They may not be attractive alternatives, but if they think that we're not reliable and they can't trust us and other things, then they'll be forced to do other things, and that will change everything. And so I say what I've said about my confidence, and the reason I have some confidence, but also I'm very aware and open to the realities of what the challenges are today.
Yeah, I mean, all I would add is I think you're right to be concerned. I think trust, as Chuck said, is something that takes a very long time to build. It can be lost very quickly and can take an even longer time to rebuild. I think reality is going to intrude in some of these issues. I mean, God forbid we face another, global health crisis. Then, investing in the National Institutes of Health starts to look like a pretty smart investment rather than corroding it. I do have a lot of faith in public servants in this country, having been one myself for almost 4 decades. The institutions that I was proud to serve with, whether it was at CIA or at the State Department, are apolitical institutions. Public servants want to have their expertise respected. They want to be trusted, but they understand that elections change policies and they'll do their level best within the bounds of their conscience to follow through and to try to implement policy choices. But without that trust in them, too, I think you're asking for trouble. And I think the more time we spend, going after an imaginary deep state, the more likely it is that we're going to end up with the wreckage of a weak state whose institutions are less able to do all the kinds of things we've been talking about, whether it's, invest in and nurture alliances and partnerships, create rules that benefit the United States as well as others in the international community. And that's what I think we need to be mindful of.
Let's see, there's a lady, a woman. Yes, you have your hand right up. I can't quite, I checked, sure. Yeah. No, maybe not checked. Yes, please. Yes, ma'am.
My question is really what you see of the fate of Poland and the Baltic countries if Ukraine goes to Putin.
I mean, I think they'll be more vulnerable. They're NATO allies. And so, I think Putin does take seriously what Article 5 of the NATO treaty means, which is that a sense of collective self-defense if the Baltic states or Poland as members of NATO are threatened. But, history has taught them to take those kind of vulnerabilities seriously, too. So it's yet another reason to ensure that we continue to provide the support to Ukraine that's going to enable it to remain a sovereign, healthy country and create the kind of leverage that you need to negotiate with Putin. He is not a sentimentalist. He's got to be convinced that the cost of continuing this war outweighs the cost of an imperfect peace, whether it's a ceasefire or something more ambitious than that. And he's not convinced of that today. And that's why I think all of us, the United States, Poland, the Baltic states, as well as Ukraine, and all of our NATO allies, have a deep interest in trying to strengthen that leverage, not as an end in itself, not designed to produce a military outcome on the battlefield, but designed to produce a just diplomatic outcome, which I think is still possible. But we can't be naive, as I was saying before, about Putin's calculus and all this too, because he is not in a rush at this point. And without feeling more pain at this point, it's very difficult for me to see how you change his calculus.
I agree with Bill.
Over here, please.
Thank you and good evening to Director Burns and Secretary Hagel.
Hey.
My question is, I would like to kindly ask your opinion on the current administration's need to reorder our present world order. It could be thought of and argued by some individuals that the recent tariffs were utilized as a tool of negotiations for national security purposes by exacting maximum leverage at present to get concessions, to isolate China and their trade with other countries. And I just wanted to ask your opinion and thoughts on that.
Sure, I'd be glad to start. I mean, on China, listen, I think there's good reason, given the Chinese government's past practice of stealing intellectual property and, erecting barriers to U.S. trade, to apply tariffs selectively, especially if you want to try to, as the last administration discussed, build a high wall around a small garden in areas like semiconductor and state-of-the-art chips, which are going to matter enormously to the economy of the future for the United States. But that's applying a scalpel, not a chainsaw, when you're talking about tariffs. And I think, you have to be really careful about the broader application of tariffs to allies and partners as well as rivals like China in ways that are going to undermine those alliance and partnership relationships too. And so, the administration has kind of gone back and forth on those issues, but I was reminded of a quote from a mutual friend of ours, Rich Armitage, a wonderful public servant who just tragically passed away a few days ago. But I remember he used to always remind me in the State Department about the first law of holes, that if you're in one and you want to get out, the first thing you should do is stop digging. And it seems to me on that kind of chainsaw approach, it's worth remembering that law.
I would just add to what Bill said is this point. On China, all the things that you want to address in whatever way you see China's relationship with us and the inequities, what Bill said, the cheating, the lying, however way you want to approach it. You don't do it the way this administration is doing it, where you cut off all of your own options by essentially cutting off all your relationships with nations, your allies and your friends around the world. It's what we're doing, and which gives China the abilities to gain ground with the very people that have been the essence of the strength of the post-World War II world order. The West as the nucleus. And so what's the strategy here? I mean, why are we just hand delivering to China the policy mistakes that we're making at a time that are critical here? It doesn't make any sense to me. If you want to, it goes back to Rich Armitage's point, if you want to try to fix some of these issues, then come at it in a smart way, a strategic way. Have a strategy about what you're doing. And that brings in your relationships with your friends, with your other partners. Take, for example, our two friends on the southern border and the northern border. I mean, Canada has been our longest, strongest partner, ally, been with us for everything, anything. I mean, why are we doing to Canada and saying the things that we're saying to Canada, belittling Canada, mocking Canada? I mean, what do we think we're gaining from that? Mexico's different, but it's really not. I mean, Denmark, what we're doing there. I mean, Panama, what we're doing there. And then, of course, putting tariffs on everybody. You know, it just doesn't make any sense to me what we're trying to accomplish here. And thinking that they're all going to bend to whatever we say, well, China's not going to do that. I mean, it's pretty clear that China's not going to do that. And that's the one big economy that you're trying to correct some imbalance in the approach to where China has been and is the approach they're taking versus our approach. Well, then let's be smart about it. So, I mean, that's where I come out on this, and I don't think it's going to end well. And in the end, this isn't going to hurt China. Yeah, it's going to have it's going to be a problem for them in a lot of ways. But you got to remember, China is a communist-dominated government. Their countrymen have no say. They've got a lot of time to play this out. They've got no free press. So there's no constituencies out in China today that are raising hell with their congressmen and their senators at town hall meetings. That's not the way it works for China. So they got a long time to go on this, wherever they have to go on this. Yeah, they've got issues. They got economic problems. They've got a lot of problems. But what they're betting is that we've got more, and we're going to continue to have more. And when they see us cutting off our own strengths, our allies, I mean, that says to them that we don't know what the hell we're doing. And that makes their own sense of and justification of their approach even more difficult, and more difficult for us to ever try to get this relationship back into some balance.
So let's try to get somebody kind of further up here, because we've been kind of going into the middle so much. So all the way in the back with that hand. Yes, right there, sir. Yes, all the way in the back. We'll go all the way in the back. Yep.
So my question is on Russia and China. There's been a touted alliance between the two countries. What credit can we give to that? Do you believe the two countries could align on strategic objectives and economic objectives in the future? And are they doing that today?
Yeah, I mean, I would take that partnership between China and Russia seriously. Certainly, as long as Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin are running those two countries, I think they've built what is much more than a marriage of convenience. It's a genuine partnership based on a shared aim, which is chipping away at an American-led international order. I think there are plenty of examples of that recently. You know, China's support for Russia's aggression in Ukraine has been considerable. Everything, as far as we could tell before I left my last job, right up to the provision of actual weapons and ammunition, but dual-use items, microelectronics, the kind of things that Russia needed to rebuild its defense industrial base and prosecute that war. So I wouldn't underestimate the strength of the partnership. Now, it's not an alliance relationship in the sense of the NATO alliance, but it's a strong and formidable partnership, which again underscores the point we both tried to make earlier about the significance of us continuing to invest in our alliances and partnerships.
I would just add to that, reemphasize what Bill said. Their relationship is very much based on the common interests that each have, but especially joining together to take down the leadership of the United States. And in the process, break the Western alliance. They don't like each other. They've had a bad history, not a good history at all. Henry Kissinger understood that in the early 70s. And that's just a reality. But when they've got a common interest, they can be very dangerous together. And they are.
I mean, there is a history too. There's a lot of historical mistrust between China and Russia. The Chinese chafed at being the junior partner of the Soviet Union during the Cold War. I'm confident the Russians are going to chafe eventually at being the junior partner of the People's Republic of China. But as I said before, I would not underestimate the strength and durability of the partnership today, and particularly, when Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin are in the picture.
So we're going to try to squeeze in one more, and I'd like to give it to somebody near the top up here. And I'm having a little problem with the light. That's why I'm having a little trouble on this side. So why don't we just go, yes, as soon as you reach somebody there, that's close enough. Sorry, as close as I could see.
Hi, my name is Patrick Schmidt, and I was wondering especially for either of you, if any of you could comment on how far you think President Trump might be willing to go to compel an armistice in Ukraine.
On an armistice in Ukraine? Well, he first started talking about this, if I recall, in the campaign, that he could solve this problem in a day. And he could do it before he takes the oath of office. Well, it's been a little more difficult than I think he anticipated. Since he's been president, what's it been, 30 days that he talked about a ceasefire, and we haven't quite seen Russia get very close to that. Yeah. I think, and Bill's going to have a better answer on this than me because he's been much closer to it. But what I've seen, I don't think Putin is particularly interested in any quick ceasefire. It's not in his interest, especially the way this administration has been moving toward the Russian position and saying the nice things about Putin personally. Latest comment from the president yesterday about, once again, Zelensky starting the war. And the longer this goes, especially with the open question whether we're going to continue to support Ukraine and the West and NATO support of Ukraine, that makes pretty clear to Putin that, and what he's doing, and he's continuing the bombing, increasing that in the invasions. No, I think it's going to be a while here, and I'm not very optimistic how this turns out.
Yeah, one of the things to watch is at some point this summer, a lot of the pipeline of U.S. military assistance that was generated in the end of the last administration is going to start to run out to Ukraine to support their ability to defend themselves. Putin is banking on the fact that he thinks maybe that pipeline isn't going to be sustained. And then, he has advantages on the battlefield. I remember I made 14 trips to Ukraine during the course of the war, which is a mark not just of the significance that not just my agency, but the United States attached to that effort, but my pride in our officers and my commitment to the Ukrainians. But I remember on one of those trips, talking to a Ukrainian officer who had been involved in the Battle of Avdiivka, which is a small industrial town in eastern Ukraine in the Donbass. And, he was talking about what happens when you begin to run low on ammunition. He said, he had one entire brigade at that moment, which had a grand total of 10 rounds of 155 artillery munitions for a brigade of 2,000 soldiers. Another brigade, similar size, had about 10 mortar rounds every day. That's all they had. And, he described what happened at Avdiivka. He said, the Russians kept coming, we ran out of ammunition, and they overran us. And, I'm not suggesting that's the future on the battlefield. I would not underestimate for a moment the courage and tenacity of the Ukrainians. The Europeans are going to try to step up their support, but I think it's going to be essential for the United States to continue to provide that support. Again, as I said before, not as an end in itself, but as a way of preserving the chances for a just negotiated outcome in which both sides, including the Ukrainians, will have to make some very hard choices, but where it's possible at least to conceive of an outcome that includes a ceasefire and armistice, which preserves what I continue to believe firmly is just in what Ukraine needs. But it's going to require a compromise. But it's not going to happen unless that leverage is preserved, not in dealing with Vladimir Putin.
So I think what we are seeing, both in your comments and in the audience, reflects the truly historic nature of our time now. I believe that the tectonic plates that are moving, the discussion of the end of the liberal order, its dismantling, we're seeing the possibility of greater change in America's relationship to the world than possibly even the end of the Cold War. This is that big of a moment. I also think that it's important to just let the audience, just to remind them that in World War II, after World War II, when we built the liberal international order, we had 50% of the world's GDP. America was not where we are today. We were half of the entire world's product. Now we're a quarter. So as things change, this is really what's underneath, I think, a lot of the discussions. Would you like, before we end, to reflect on those comments?
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I'd add is, I still think we have a better hand to play as long as we're working with our allies and partners. Yes, it's true. In 1945, the United States had roughly 50% of global GDP. Today, we and our European allies and Japan have well over 50% of global GDP. China and Russia together have something like 20%. So it's a strong hand to play, but it requires us to invest in allies and partners and be mindful of the fact that with them, and even dealing with some leverage with our rivals in China and Russia, we have an ability to set rules. I know when anybody from Washington, me or anybody else, talks about liberal international order, whenever I speak outside Washington, people glaze over. So whatever terminology you want to use, the truth is it is in the interests of the United States to be able to set some basic rules of the road in a world which is far more interconnected than 40 years ago when I was a very young Foreign Service officer, when climate change and global health crises or other pandemics pose huge challenges which require us, whether we like one another or not, to try to establish certain rules and live by them. And of course they need to be updated. Of course American public institutions like the ones I served need to be reformed. Anybody who's worked in government can tell you that more easily than anybody else. But you've got to do it, I think, in a thoughtful way, in a way that's respectful of the value of public service in this country.
Well, first of all, I saw no eyes glazing over when you spoke. I would just add my absolute agreement to everything that Bill said. Everybody in this room knows today's gone. It's all about tomorrow. It's always about tomorrow. And we need to think that way, and we need to act that way. We haven't always, but we've done it most of the 250 years of this country, and I think we got another 250 years to go. I don't think I'll be around, but Bill might be. So thank you.
Well, let's thank everybody on the stage. Thank you very much. And Chuck, if you'll stand up. One of the big things that gives me tremendous confidence for the future is the ability to have dialogue like this, thoughtful dialogue with the audience. So thank you all very, very much. This is the real strength of America coming together. And the fact that it's happening here in our heartland is so important. And Director Burns, thank you so much for today. Chuck, thank you.
Thanks, Bill.
And
thank you.
Before, I also want to give you a little token of our thanks as our 5th Hagel lecturer. And please, everybody, welcome or thank them again for all they've done.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That was just absolutely fantastic. Really terrific. Chuck, you were just absolutely terrific.
Looks right.